Today's topic is using Spark for application, or using Spark in the application development lifecycle. And as usual with these sessions, they're typically triggered by a question from one or more users of the platform. So again, this is one that's has been quite common. So I've heard it. We've been asked this many times. I've also been involved in many projects looking at how to do this type of work. So I've got a little process mapped out here in terms of the stages that we'd go through. But I guess the main question that seems to come up most of all is, what's the best way to, or typically starts with, what's the best way to capture requirements in Spark and related to the process. But then it sort of moves into other territories like, should we be capturing user stories and not requirements? Or how do we capture user stories and requirements? Or how do we hand this over, or what do we hand over to the development team? So that's kind of, there's a lot in there, and there's a lot of context required to know the kind of best way, or to think through the best way to do that. So what I'm going to try to do today is just sort of talk about some of the different concepts, and then talk through a different way of looking at this process or life cycle. And then I'll provide some examples of different ways that we've set people up to do this, or got people up and running with doing this sort of thing. So you'll see on the screen here, I've got a list of different requirement types, but I think just before I start talking through these, it's also worth just highlighting that when I talk about the application development lifecycle, I'm actually talking about something very, very broad. So it could be anything from implementing an off-the-shelf system that requires configuration to be implemented, right through to developing custom software that needed to support a particular process within the organization, and then everything in between, whether it's no code, low code type applications, or pure software development, whatever it is. There's a lot of similarities through this, but with some subtle differences depending on which of those that you're doing. So let's start with I just want to talk a little bit through the different I've called them requirement types. I guess some of these aren't really requirements, but these are the sort of common things that we get asked about in this area, and I'm sure there's probably more. So the most common thing that we get asked about is business requirements. So I tend to think about that as what is it the business needs. So typically you've identified some sort of need or desire or opportunity to automate something or build some sort of system to support an existing process. So the business requirements are all about what are the things the business needs to achieve. So, for example, if it's we're putting automation in to speed things up, what is it the business needs? Well, it needs that widget needs to continue flowing through, but it needs to do at a faster rate. And then there's typically some sort of constraints that you might have around that. So it could be we need to speed up the number of widgets, but we also need to do them within the various rules and regulations. So that's kind of what I think of as the business requirements level. And then what often or can flow from that is things like functional requirements and technical requirements. So the business requirement is more about what we're trying to achieve and the constraints, whereas the functional requirements are more like what's the thing that we're building actually going to do. And then the technical requirements get right into the detail, like it's got to have certain type of what's the word I'm looking for, security requirements, we might have data requirements, integration requirements, those sort of more very, very specific things. And then often in those conversations, what we bump up against, or the teams can bump up against, is, yeah, but our team use user stories. So how does this relate to user stories? So a little bit of background on user stories. These were traditionally associated with agile software development, although they're not necessarily a specific part of agile software development, but they were developed by a company doing software development that I forget the name of the organization now, but essentially what this was about was really trying to do what business requirements do, but from a user's perspective. So user stories traditionally were very, very simple constructs where you said, as a particular type of user, I need to do this thing so that I get some output. So it was about becoming a bit more user centric in terms of requirements, but also thinking about the value that was delivered by doing this sort of thing. So it was really a communication tool to help communication between the development team or the developers building whatever the thing was and the business and what they needed the software or app to do. So as I said, it started off really, really simple. Nowadays, you start to see lots more information added to user stories as well. The problem with those often, though, is they're very low level, or sometimes they're described at very high level. So then someone said, well, actually, a collection of user stories are epics. And then they'll say, oh yeah, but my user story is still too high, or it's describing a business requirement, so I need to translate that into a development task. Or I might have use cases or user journeys to help as well. The point of all of this is that actually there's lots and lots of different ways to describe what we need from an application. My job here is not to say, well, this is what this one means and that's what that one means. It's more to sort of highlight the fact that there is no kind of universally agreed way of describing these requirements and then passing them through to the software development team. That's not to say that individual organizations and teams have clearly defined what these different things are, and that's what I'd urge you to do. One of the sort of takeaway points from this is to really think through what those are and where you need them. So what I'm going to do in a second, first, before I do, what I'm going to do a second is sort of take you through what's actually happening as we're addressing some of these things. But before that, I just want to give a quick overview of what I've called the app development lifecycle. This is a slightly higher level view, and then we'll go into a bit more detail. But typically, we've got some sort of strategy or initiative or project that's saying we need to go and automate stuff, or we're going to change out a system, or we're going to put a system in where one doesn't exist today. So typically we need to go and identify what the opportunities for improvement are. This is typically because partly we want to understand where are the problem areas, what are we going to fix, what's the business case going to be for doing this. It might be, again, if we're implementing a low-code platform, we're looking at what are the different things that we could automate today, or RPA, or any of those types of technologies. So we'll come up with some sort of prioritized list of things that we could go and work on. Then what we're going to do is, traditionally, a business analyst would go out and gather the requirements. What is it that the system needs to do? That then gets picked up by the development team, and where they would do some sort of planning. Now, again, I'm not really here to sort of talk about the difference between agile development and waterfall. It doesn't really matter from this level, whether it's waterfall, where you're planning everything up front, or whether it's agile, where you're doing your planning on a weekly or 2-weekly basis. You're still taking the requirements as inputs from the business, and then you're trying to turn that into some sort of predictable tasks that your development team have to do. Then your developers develop whatever it is, and I use the term developer as, again, if this is some sort of off-the-shelf product that needs to be configured, you might have some sort of There might be some sort of admin or someone like that doing it, but it's basically the same thing. You worked out what needs to be done based on the requirements, and then you go and do it. And then from having developed that app or configured it, then we do some sort of testing and launch it. So it goes into business as usual. The organization is using it. And then there's ongoing work to maintain and update those apps. Now, I think part of the challenge arises, or what we see, or the confusion arises in teams where we get to this part here. So it's the gathering of the requirements and then handing it over to the development team to start planning how they're going to do something. And I, flashed up those different sort of requirement types before. So often we will have teams sitting here going, well, we're gathering business requirements and then we're going to hand them over to development to do something with them. Or we'll have business analysts talking about user stories, which they then hand over to the development team. This action or activity should be collaborative. And again, if you are looking at it from an agile perspective, you have this concept of a product owner who is allegedly the business representative that works closely with the development team to clearly explain the thinking behind the user stories and why they're required, that sort of thing. So bringing that business perspective. And again, that's one of the key things for me about this, regardless of what you're using and how you're using it. There needs to be a clear line of communication between what's happening in development and outside of it. And what I'm often seeing in teams today is that they're gathering some sort of requirements here as business analysts, and then almost handing that over the fence to the development team. And then the development team might be turning that into user stories because they're taking those requirements and saying, we need to break that down into something that we can then size, or they're taking it down to another level where they can issue tasks and so on to developers. And then what happens is the analyst says, well, if you're creating user stories, we can create the user stories and then hand them over, but you still end up with the same problem that it's basically siloed work. Okay, so again, key takeaway is regardless of what you call the requirements or how you describe them, you need that clear communication between those two teams. So just to kind of break that down another level of I've called this a different way of looking at this process. And what I've done is highlighted a little bit here in red, which is often where the process can go wrong, but where the focus ends up being when it goes wrong later on, and why communication is so important. So again, we've got some sort of requirement to increase digitization, and I fear, again, very similar to the previous one, is we need to identify those opportunities to digitize. Now, what I've done here is started to call out notes, because I think from a communications perspective, this is one of the things that seems to get lost as we go through the process, and that's why are we doing this in the first place? That needs to be kind of reinforced throughout to remind people what we're actually trying to achieve. So, I've put something very, very simple here, but why is it we're trying to digitize something? Is it to speed things up, reduce mistakes, make it easier to report on information, a combination of those things, or something else? But again, important to work out why we're doing that. Then essentially what we're doing is, once we've identified some opportunities, we weren't trying to evaluate those for feasibility and value. Now, one of the things you'll notice on this example process is I haven't put any roles on it, because again, I want people to think about who needs to be involved in this. So in my previous example, this step was roughly the one where the business analyst goes away and starts trying to capture the requirements and building a business case from it. But actually, we need to be thinking about what is the business value. So I've described it here. Is it possible to do this, and is it worth us doing this? And sometimes often that will require someone from your technical or development team to be involved early on. A lot of times I see like system architects and so on being involved, because they'll understand the art of the possible with the technology. They'll understand some of the constraints, so they'll often be able to answer that question early on as to whether something's even feasible, and is it worth doing. Then what you need to do is, if once you've addressed that, is you then need to dig in. Again, this is typically covered by the requirements, but it's capture, and I've changed the language here to say what's the needs of the business to reach the desired outcome, including the known constraints. So another way I thought to think about it is what's the minimum required to achieve the benefits that we've identified in the previous step. So again, that's something that we need to work out. What are the really important needs that we need to be able to deliver? And we need to break that down into the things that we cannot live without. And we need to be very, very disciplined about how we define that. And then other things that would be good to have, but we could live without. I'll touch on things like Moscow in a second. Now, the other bit that often gets forgotten about is this last step I've put over here on the top row, and that's once we understand the needs of the business, we also need to understand the needs of the people that are actually going to use this. And again, I think this often gets missed out. In my previous slide, I had the thing about user journeys and use cases. Now, often that's where that can start to get addressed. So if you're doing that sort of thing, it's quite valuable to do. But this is again a key part, because if you don't think about this, then you might build something that functionally works but is too complicated for someone to use. Then what happens? So we've understood our needs of the business and the users. We've determined that it's feasible and valuable to do. Then this is where the development planning tends to come in. Those requirements that we've gathered, which are often still in a sort of kind of business focused description, that needs to be translated into development work. So someone needs to work out to break that down into what are the individual tasks to do, but also how we're going to sequence those tasks. Because again, sometimes to build something that might be quite a simple requirement to start with is going to require a database and some sort of architecture to be put in place, which could take quite a long time. So that's can be quite a skilled technical exercise to do. Again, breaks the requirements down into the logical parts so they can be assembled. Then you can move into actually building them, and this is a key part. So I've called this align development tools with business and user needs, but what I basically mean is your developers or technical team saying, right, these are the needs of the organization, and this is the tool set or apps that I've got available to be able to try and meet those needs. And that's what developers are essentially trying to do. Now, what happens quite a lot is that where the requirement has been described, it's not always possible to do that technically or easily with the development tools available. So here, this is where I called out the red bit. So if it's not easy to meet, then the team then have to go, well, is there an alternative approach that we can take? And how long should we continue to explore that alternative approach? Like at some point, we've got to make a decision is, yes, we can meet the needs and then carry on, or actually it's going to take way too long, or it's simply not possible. And if that's the case, they then need to work out what is the extent of the limitation, what are we prepared to limit this on? And this is where an awful lot of time gets lost in, or can go missing in development, where things can often go wrong, because depending on the level or the type of requirement you've got, the developers are trying to meet the tasks that they've been issued, which have been translated from the requirements. And this is why that line of communication with the development team and the business is so important, because the sooner you can identify that this is not easily possible, and then discuss with the business how long should we spend on it, and if it's going to take longer than we want it to, where can we agree that we will deliver something that might not be the thing we need, which is why it's so important early on to know what are the absolute non-negotiable things that you need to deliver. And then from there, we can then start to, say, ensure the business and user needs are correctly met, which is essentially the sort of testing of the application. The key point I'm trying to get here is that actually what tends to happen in these processes is that we start from the business need, and then we gradually abstract what we were trying to get in order to describe something that needs to be developed or built or configured. And each level of abstraction we take, so first one might be we map the process, then we capture some requirements, then we turn those requirements into user stories and epics, then those user stories get turned into development tasks. Each time we do one of those abstractions, we're getting further and further away from that original question of why do we need this in the first place. And so essentially what we need to do is to make sure that we can keep these things aligned and close as possible. So again, my advice at this point is to think about, when you're looking at this part of the process, is how do we create a set of source material that is very clearly describes what the business needs and why it needs it. And although you might build development tasks which you use to assign to developers and track how quick or how much progress they're making, you always want to be referencing that source material, so the developers will reference the same process and requirements information as what was gathered and agreed by the business, and keep a line of communication, so to the extent that you have to change the approach, there is a conversation. But again, if we change the process, we can achieve a similar sort of outcome or output. That's the sort of key message, if you like. Now, quickly, just sort of dive into some of the different things that we've got around those capturing requirements in Spark. So starting right very, very simply, the way we capture processes in Spark, our activity and YBox or outputs the questions we used were very deliberately designed around the idea of a user story. So as this role, I do this thing so that I get some output or outcome. So that right from the very beginning helps people to think about what is it we do and why do we do it? What's the output that we get? So that just driving the process from that perspective is already helping you to start thinking about that value, and hence why it's so important for developers or technical teams to be referencing the same material as the business. Because if they've got to go back and ask questions about, I wanted to look at doing this in a different way, I need to know what the business was really trying to achieve, rather than reading some sort of technical requirement in a database without the context of what the business needs. Just as a reference, if anyone's kind of really interested in this sort of stuff, there is a concept of user story mapping, which essentially it's like user journey mapping but built out of user stories, and Spark works really well for doing that, because you can basically map the user stories as a process, and then that could be broken down into what the development team need to do. Other common ways of capturing requirements, so we've got using a custom field, which I'll just drop into edit mode here just to show this. So I've got a very simple custom field. This is a very quick and easy way of doing it. I've worked with teams and captured requirements probably most commonly using this approach, because it's very, very quick. You attach the custom field against the activity. Here I've used the grouping to cover things using an approach like Moscow. So if you're not familiar with Moscow, it's just about categorizing your requirements into your must-haves, which technically should be your non-negotiables. It's like, it won't work if I don't have this. Your should-haves, which are important things to have but we could live without. Could-haves are your kind of nice-to-haves or your delighters, and then won't-haves are things that we definitely don't want in the system. So that's just a nice way of categorizing them, and then you simply just describe what the requirement is. Now, I found this to be one of the best ways because in workshopping with the business, you can very, very quickly add lots and lots of requirements. And then typically what I do afterwards is refine those. You'll find lots of duplications and so on. And then we can take that information and work with it. But I have worked with other teams where we've gone one step further and we've created a business requirement form. So here, I'll come and edit this. So what we did here is it's kind of similar, but we had the ability to write a name. So again, once you're then reporting and managing the requirements, it makes it a bit easier. An ID if required. But more importantly, so we've got a description and then things like acceptance criteria and business value. And the purpose of this was to generate conversation, so get people talking about the requirement, but thinking about, okay, well, if I were to test the requirement, what does that test look like? And what business value does this requirement give me? And by simply going through that simple conversation, it helps then, we've got Moscow again, but it helps you make a judgment on these. So is it really a must have or could have or should have or won't have? So again, it provides a bit more information, again, for whoever's then trying to develop or configure the system later, and helps you address that kind of prioritization, if you like. And very, very quickly, I've got an example of a technical requirement here. So again, it's just a form. This is a slightly different one, but this goes into technical descriptions. So we're looking at from a data, are we presenting data, processing it, transferring it, manually inputting notifications? What are the rules that might need to be applied? What types of data there might be? Again, test criteria for the data or the transformation, and then some sort of priority. These are all custom built forms, so they're very easy to build yourself if you want them. The requirement form that I showed there is available in the library in the Netcall community app share, so you can copy a template of that straight into your workspace if you want it. And then just to finish off, a couple of final considerations to think about. So for me, I think the biggest challenge to overcome in this process, so as always with anything Spark related, we always think keep it simple. So my view is you map the process, you capture the business requirements to the extent that you can from the team, and then you work with the development team to build the tasks that they need to be able to do that work. And then you keep a constant line of communication between the business and the development team. You use the process models and the attached requirements to then make adjustments if in case you've hit any limitations in the technology, and then discussions and document clearly why you've changed it and what you've changed. But that point is, about being lost in translation. If you go through lots of levels of abstraction, you're just creating more barriers between those two teams to communicate and more opportunity for, each level of abstraction you go through, you're diluting the context. And that's the key thing. The development team need to understand the context as much as anyone else. Keep a clear line of communication between the two teams. Be very clear on the non-negotiables, and I say limited. So, like your non-negotiables or your must-haves, you have to be 100 or as close to 100% sure that they are non-negotiables as possible. Because if it's not possible to deliver them, does that completely derail the whole thing? Hence why I say be limited in that. And agree a process to resolve issues in the events that needs cannot be easily met. So that's the point. It's not just having that clear line of communication, but have some sort of process of forum where there's a constant communication between those two teams.